Okay, so a wonderful day to everyone. So for today, we are going to study the scope and delimitation. So I'll be also giving you a few tips on how you could possibly write your scope and delimitation. So credits to the development team of this module, specifically SDO Navotas. So I found this online and it works well. So I do not claim ownership to this module. So for this lesson, we are going to look into scope and delimitation. So the best way that I could compare this part to is like the table, like literal na table, like la mesa. So the scope and delimitation would identify how much your study would cover, okay, and what it would not be covering. So just like a table, it would cover, it would house, or it would contain what you want to serve to people, and of course, you would see what you would not include as well. So for that metaphor, let's move further to the lesson proper. So the study's variables would determine the study scope. So if you're talking about the height of a plant, or let's say the study habits of students, those would determine what your study would cover. So while the subvariables and their characteristics, attributes, or indicators would serve as the delimitation. Okay? So in this case, we would like to underscore the terms that are highly important for you for this part. Okay? So we have the word scope and delimitation. So the scope would anchor on the variables. We've studied about the variables in the past, okay? And then the delimitation would be the subvariables and even the characteristics, attributes, and indicators. So it is important that when you write your scope and delimitation, that you already finalized your variables. And my dear students, it's very difficult to reach this part without your variables being finalized yet. Because by this time, you have already written your background of the study, you have written your statement of the problem. So it would be a waste of effort and time if you would not have finalized your variables yet. By this time, sure na kayo kung ano yung gusto yung pag-aralan. So scope specifies or identifies the coverage of your studies, like your variables, population, participant, and timeline. So anong meron? Ano yung sakop niya? Ano yung coverage niya? On the other hand, we have the limitation. The limitation would cite the factors of your study. What are not included? Sino ang hindi kasama? Or those you will not deal with in your study. So if you would consider this, parang kumbaga sa paper, there is a circle. Etong circle na to, nandito sa loob, ang scope mo, at yung nasa labas would be your delimitation, kung ano ang hindi mo isasali. Kasi this would give the clarity on your end, okay? Kung ano ba talaga ang focus ng paper mo. So there would be the clarity. Everything is clear. You know what's included, and what's not included. Just like when you go to a grocery store, di ba? Alam mo kung ano dapat ang bibilihin mo at ano yung hindi mo bibilihin. So same goes with research. To save resources, to save money, you would know what to include and what not to include. Okay? I hope we're clear with that. So let's move on. Let's try to identify further the differences, okay? The difference between scope and I mean the delimitation and the limitation of a study. Okay? So the limitations, as indicated here, are the characteristics that can be controlled, okay? And they would determine the parameters and scope of the study. Like the researcher, you as the researcher would have the control over it. So example, the researcher indicates the methodology to use the stratified random sampling. So this is your choice and decision. But my dear students, allow me to remind you that especially when it comes to methodology, when you create decisions, they should be backed up by studies, okay? There should be reasoning. There should be um basis, okay? There should be supporting studies, okay? It's not just because it's what you want, but it's because it is what the studies and related literature indicates, okay? at may basis ka. Hindi yung pwedeng, ito yung gusto ko, ito yung number of participants that I want. No, you cannot do that. There should always be an empirical basis. There should always be a clear reasoning why you chose that. The limitations, on the other hand, limitations are the weaknesses, okay? So these are the things that you as a researcher cannot control. So example, the researcher is going to use stratified random sampling technique, as you have indicated in your methodology. Pero, while you were conducting the study, nakita mo na very few possible participants lang pala. And that random sampling may be quite difficult to conduct. So the researcher, your choice of sampling technique becomes a limitation of the study. Even if you chose stratified random sampling, then nakita mo na very konti, very limited ang pwedeng maging participants ng study mo, or should we say respondents, that becomes a limitation because the number of available participants or respondents would be beyond your control, especially if you have selected the locality already. Kaya nga very important din na alam mo yung nature ng locality mo, alam mo yung nature ng mga respondents, participants mo. Okay, so that's the difference. The limitation is what you can control, and the limitation is something that you cannot control. For the components of scope and delimitation, here are the following things that you have to bear in mind. Of course, the topic of the study. So, what are the variables that are included at hindi kasali? Okay? What are the objectives? Okay? Or problems to be addressed? Okay? Are we addressing a problem? Are we addressing the objectives? And why are we doing this study? By the way, there are some studies that would prefer statement of the problem. So you have research questions, while there are also some who would prefer statement of the objectives. So you could use them interchangeably. Okay? So at times, there are other papers naman that would indicate the questions sa separate ng objectives. But you could actually use objectives, state the objectives. Okay? But again, it depends upon the institution and the format ng school ninyo. We also have the time frame. Like when are you going to conduct the study? You have to be clear about the when, about the time. And the locale of the study, like where, saan mo gagawin ang gathering of data. And of course, you could also include the characteristics of the respondents. Like who will be your respondents? Who would be participating in your um paper or in your study. So these are the questions that you could actually ask as you write your scope and delimitation. Pwede mo nang sagutin yan, and then once you have answered these, if you wish to like give more supporting studies, or if you want to elaborate further using more details, pwede na. And then that's already the part that you have to accomplish. Okay? Ito na yung part na isasubmit mo. So these could serve as your guide questions aside from the template that I have presented to you. Okay? So again, topic of the study, objectives or problems to be addressed, time frame, locale of the study, and then characteristics of the respondents. And of course, I almost missed this out, method and research instruments. So how are you going to collect your data? So this could be a little tricky kasi, ma'am, bakit ganun? Eh, di ba ang kino-cover natin pa lang is yung chapter 1 or the first part, the introduction part. Bakit meron na tayong method and research instruments? So if you remember, during our discussion in person, pinaready na natin yung topic, yung instruments, tapos yung general research question. Kasi dapat aligned yung mga yan. So, if we're being practical about matters, before we even begin with the entire introduction, kailangan sure ka na dun sa research instrument mo. You already have what you would use. Kasi it's very difficult for you to do it na you already have all of the write-up, you already have the first few chapters, tapos wala ka palang makikita instrument. And the creation of a research instrument from scratch is a research paper in itself. Hindi siya pwedeng, pwede naman akong gumawa ng survey. No, it requires validation, it requires checking of reliability, it would require pilot testing pa. So, as senior high school students, if you are senior high school students who are listening to me right now, I would recommend that you look for standardized instruments or instruments that were already used by the past researchers that were already published. So, With that, okay, we have presented scope and delimitation. So these are the possible questions that you could answer while you are trying to write your part if ever sa inyo napunta to. So again, when we're talking about scope and delimitation, we identify what is included and what is not included. Okay? So for the writing part of this, you could use about 2 to 3 paragraphs for this. Allow me to type here 2 to 3 paragraphs. For the senior high school students, I would usually recommend using the first paragraph for the scope and the second paragraph for the delimitation. Okay? So you would just have to indicate in the scope, okay, as mentioned, what is covered, the coverage. For the delimitation, what is not included. In other institutions, they would use the concepts of inclusion criteria and the exclusion criteria. Okay? So if it goes that way, actually the idea is almost the same. Inclusion, what is included, exclusion, what's not included. Scope, that's the coverage. Delimitation, what is not included. So I hope we're clear with that. Okay? Should you have questions, feel free to comment, feel free to ask me. I could always make a response and come up with another video. So don't forget to like and subscribe when you have time, and then just wait for the next video. Okay? So I'll see you around. Have a wonderful day and keep safe. Happy writing. Bye.